cannon to cannon, broadside to broadside, blood for blood. With splinters flying in a flare of powder, this video shall cover the iconic duel between ships at sea, from tactics and maneuvers to weapons and preparation. The savage reality of pirate ship combat. We know these battles fondly from video games, literature, and cinema. Duels between two ships, two crews, two commanders looking to outwit, outmaneuver, outcourage the other. In the age of sail, they were often called rencounters, stemming from the French rencontre, literally meaning encounter. The goal of such a battle varied. A merchant might simply look to defend itself, keeping the ship afloat until the enemy was beaten enough to pull back. Such might also be the case for pirates, unable to escape a pirate hunter or man-o'-war. Some merchants possessed certain commissions called letters of marque, which did allow them to capture enemy ships if they got the opportunity, making the battle about more than just survival. For pirates, of course, the goal was usually to capture the opponent, plunder, and take him as a prize. In order to capture the ship, they needed to board it. In some cases, they might be able to sail downwind and board the chase immediately, either taking them then and there and initiating boarding combat. In other cases, the enemy was able to resist boarding by fire, leading to a rencounter. Therefore, pirates initiated most rencounters in order to soften the enemy enough to either make them surrender or make the ship safe enough to board. Rencounters were not to the pirates' advantage. A common myth is that they didn't want to damage the enemy's cargo by shooting at them. Most of the cargo was kept safe in the hold below the waterline. It was difficult to hit a ship below the waterline, and pirate cannons were seldom strong enough to actually pierce the sturdy hull of merchantmen. The cargo would not be destroyed. Instead, it was more common to target enemy crew and rig, and kill enough men and the rest might surrender, or simply be unable to defend against a boarding attack. Destroy their rig, you destroy their means of mobility, making a smart captain strike a main. That is, surrender by taking in their topsails, or make them unable to get out of the way as you move behind or in front of them, where any ship is the weakest, and you can blast them through the entire length of the ship with predictable consequences. Even if pirates might not destroy the cargo, the destruction of the enemy ship was not preferred either. It prevented the pirates from taking and selling the ship, or using it for themselves. We might imagine pirates sinking and blowing up ships in duels at sea, but if anyone was likely to sink, it were the pirates. The optimal pirate ship was built to be as light as possible, in order to maximize speed and chasing. In turn, it made them susceptible to heavy artillery, even sinking. Meanwhile, men-of-war and merchant vessels were sturdy and resilient. They could afford to duke it out in drawn-out duels, and had no qualms about sinking the pirate, since they usually wanted them dead, even if the cargo, prize money and bounties were a juicy bonus. In 1698, a French pirate ship ended up in a running fight against the Bedford galley, able to put several broadsides in the pirate. I fired so many shot into him as tore him all to pieces, and 'tis me a wonder how he swam, remarked Captain Robert Holliman. The pirates had most of their officers killed but managed to escape into the night, where the ship eventually sank. Next morning, an abundance of wreckage and bodies floated ashore. That is not to say that all pirate ships were weak. Some possessed powerful ships of force. It was especially common in the Indian Ocean, where pirate captains like Henry Every, Olivier Levasseur, Robert Culliford and John Bowen possessed large and powerful ships. These were less common in the Caribbean, not unheard of, but most encounters were between sloops, brigantines, or light frigates. Even then, A rencounter could be costly in weapons, ammunition, and repairs. Piracy was all about maximizing profits at a minimal investment. It was preferable to either board the enemy and take them by storm, or intimidate them into a surrender. But if the enemy was well equipped, either was impossible, and they had to take the fight. Rencounters required extensive prep. As discussed in the previous episode, preparation was initiated as soon as another ship was spotted, and pirates tried to keep their ship in a perpetual state of readiness. A merchant might require hours to clear the decks before battle, and if a pirate was fast enough, they might be able to close the distance and board before their target had fully prepared. They had to ready both the ship, the weaponry, the various specialists, and the crew at large. First came the ship. At the captain's command, it had to be cleared for action. This meant the removal of everything that could obstruct or cause splintering. On the main deck, the ship's boat, usually a canoe in the New World, was set into the water and towed behind the ship. Animals were often kept on the weather deck. Pigs and chicken might be allowed to roam freely, and they had to be penned below deck. A lot of clearing was to be done here. The crew usually had their meals on collapsible tables between the cannons. These had to be felled up, the utensils stowed. The same applied for the crew's belongings, kept in their sea chests. Their hammocks, beddings, and mattresses were hung up on the sides of the ship in order to dampen or even absorb potential splintering. Splinters, produced by cannonballs striking the hull of a ship, were a great source of damage, death, and infection in the Aegis sail. To further make the ship clear and safe, bulkheads, internal partitions, were taken down. Pirates often had them taken down permanently. After the ship had been cleared, the men were assigned to their stations or quarters. These were clearly defined by a document called the quarter bill. All of the officers and most of the artisans had clearly defined quarters. Regular crewmen did not. Instead, every quarter and its officers needed a certain number of men, and the crew were delegated based upon it. Of course, it was best to delegate them based on their individual skills and experience. For example, a quarter bill for a small privateer determined that every cannon should have 6 men each. The second marine officer should have 9 musketeers, and so on. For reference, I'm basing this information on the quarter bill of a 20-gun privateer. Larger or smaller ships might have had more or less men designated to the quarters, but this will serve as a baseline. We're going to go through all of the quarters, starting from the top of the ship, the masts. During combat, most of the crew were needed on the guns and muskets, meaning that only a skeleton crew could handle the sails and rigging. A ship in combat would typically just sail under the topsails, providing less obstruction and requiring less men to use. These were called the fighting sail, and might include additional ones like the forecourse, mizzen, and headsails. More sails than that were only used in a running fight, when the goal was to escape. During combat, the bosun was put in charge of the sails and rigging. He was typically relegated to the foremast with 2 men, and the bosun's mate on the mainmast, also with 2 men. Before combat, they would sling the yards with chains in order to prevent them from being shot away. Puddings and pladdings were placed between the chains and masts in order to prevent chafing. Spare materials were laid out in case damaged rigging had to be repaired. They furled the non-fighting sails so the rest could be managed by a small crew, and improved visibility for the officers and fighters. The lower masts and topmasts were connected by platforms called tops. Each top had 5 men designated to it, the main top a petty officer. The topmen would repair the rigging if damaged, observe the conduct and condition of the enemy, and ply them with small arms and grenades. We can presume that the topmen were the best marksmen. They were furnished with ammunition and a case of muskets. each shooter usually having multiple of them, to allow for continuous fire. They might have designated loaders. They were also issued boxes of grenades, including fragmentation grenades, fireballs, and stink pots. The tops were covered by a red cloth called the fights or top armor, serving to conceal the men behind them. On the main deck and the gun deck below it, the decks were swabbed wet in order to fireproof them. The cannons were prepared. On a ship, they are always called guns or great guns. The gun ports were knocked loose, the guns freed, and their train tackles rigged, allowing them to be pulled out after firing and reloading. They were then supplied with their necessary tools, and between every gun were placed tubs of seawater and blankets for fighting fires. Matches were lit for the linstocks, shots placed in cases or garlands, and powder kept in paper cartridges for quick, safe, and reliable loading. Every gun had a gun crew assigned to it, the size of which depended on the size of the gun. A 3-pounder might have 2 men, with cabin boys for bringing powder from the magazine below. Also on the main deck, the swivel guns were placed in their stanchions, shot and powder brought for them and for the musketeers deployed on the main deck. On the quarterdeck, the captain oversaw and commanded the entire ship. The master assisted him as was needed. A midshipman passed on orders to the rest of the ship, going from the officers to the men. The quartermaster was assigned to the helm, for commanding the helmsman. Helm referred to the steering device, and it was crucial to assign a reliable helmsman. Someone strong and courageous to handle it in battle, especially since the helm was often targeted by enemy muskets. Like the tops, the sides of the quarterdeck were shrouded with red cloth. Moving down below, the guns on the gun deck were prepared the same way as the ones above. Moving further down to the hold, the carpenter and his crew were to attend the pumps for pumping out leaking water, be ready with plugs for plugging shot holes, and to repair any damage. These plugs were either made from mattresses or wood. The gunner's mate operated a magazine or powder room, where he and an assistant prepared paper cartridges, filled them with powder, and handed them to the powder monkeys fetching, well, powder for the gun crews above. In the back of the hold, or elsewhere deemed safe enough, the surgeon set up his cockpit, also called Lion's Den. This is where he treated the wounded. An operating table was cleared and readied, all of his tools laid out, and the floor covered with sand or sawdust to suck up the blood and prevent slipping. That should cover all of the quarters. When everything was ready, the captain might try and improve morale. He might hold a rousing speech, trying to motivate them with patriotism or the lure of plunder, the faults of the enemy perhaps. Or he would just issue armor, alias pot valiancy, a shot of liquor. Many pirates were drunk in the time of engagement, others placed strict regulations against it. Some captains abhorred drunkenness so much as to avoid pot valiancy. Woodes Rogers issued hot chocolate before battle. Other men found courage in religion, holding prayers, perhaps even having a priest to hold mass. Cowardice was to be expected. On some ships, the hatches to the lower decks were lashed and secured to prevent anyone from escaping to safety below. In some cases, captains and officers might threaten to shoot any cowards. Disobedience was another issue, especially among pirates who trended towards democracy. In battle, the pirate captain was to possess supreme authority. Some of them would execute anyone that disobeyed them on the spot. However, there are also cases of pirates openly disagreeing with each other during a battle. When the merchant ship Darrell was assaulted by the pirate ship Mocha, William Reynolds reported how the pirates first attempted to negotiate, when one of them suddenly sprung forth, crying out, "Strike, you dogs!" He was subsequently pulled down. The merchant boatswain also broke rank, responding to the pirates, "We should not strike to no such dogs." The captain wasn't pleased, but let it be. A prisoner aboard the Maka, William Willocks, wrote of a previous incident, where the pirates first held a general election if they should engage a ship or not. When the pirates received a beating, they held another election on whether they should retire or not. They decided to pull back. These quote-unquote elections were somewhat ad hoc, and just consisted of someone voicing his opinion, others agreeing and others repeating that opinion or calling for an alternative. If the pirates voted to engage, there was nothing left but for battle to commence. Musicians beat their drums and sounded trumpets, and both sides hoisted the colors of their respective nations. Pirates would fly both their black flags and that of their national origins. In the calm before the storm, both crews would begin shouting at each other. They might praise their king at the best, insult their opponents at worst, with attacks ranging from the national, racial, religious, and sexual. 18th century pirates took it to the next level, with something called vaporing. They would play loud music, get drunk, dance, shout, and wave around their swords. Everything they could to terrify their enemy and show their courage. Sometimes it was enough to make the enemy strike, other times not, and actual shots would fire. The distance of a sea fight would differ based on a variety of factors. If one of the ships had attempted to flee, the fight might not erupt until the chaser was right next to them. If both vessels decided to fight, it would usually occur at the maximum range. This was most often within the point-blank range of a cannon. That is, the distance at which a cannon can be aimed level with the target without having to compensate for bullet drop. This was between 3 to 400 feet, or 90 to 120 meters. It was also the effective range of muskets. Cannons are seen as the quintessential weapon of sea warfare. Some, like the English, prefer them more than the French or Spanish. The pirate guns were usually small, 3 to 6 pounders, with the largest pirate ships seldom having guns heavier than 18. These small guns were seldom able to pierce the hull of a stout merchantman. Woodes Rogers wrote about putting hundreds of shot into the hull of the Manila galleon, most of it just bouncing off. It was preferable to fire on exposed men and the rigging. If one ship had its rigging destroyed, it could break morale and force a surrender, or render the enemy immobile enough for you to outmaneuver them. Regular cannonballs, often called bullets, were some of the most common shot. At close distances, they might be double or even triple loaded, often in conjunction with specialized ammunition. Shot like bar or chain shot were excellent for destroying sails and rigging. Scattering shot like musket balls were used for the same, and especially good for wiping out crew. A cheap but no less effective option was scattering junk, including glass, porcelain, stones, and iron scrap. Whether the guns were fired into the enemy's sides, her masts, or upper deck, a broadside-to-broadside duel was a battle of courage, will, and attrition. Whichever side lost the will or meant to fight, lost the battle. It was rare for a fight to result in a ship sinking, and bullets alone could not cause explosions. Ships did blow up in battle, but that was caused by accident, a flame getting into the powder room. The rate of fire was fairly slow, given the loading procedure, maneuvering of the ship, and desire to avoid overheating the guns. One broadside every 7 minutes was fast for a pirate ship. Nor was it common to fire a true broadside, that is, discharging all guns at once or in rapid succession. It could cause significant damage to the superstructure of the vessel, and rolling broadsides were preferred. These made the individual guns more accurate, since the shot could be timed based on the movements of the ship and rolling of the sea. One can imagine that operating these pieces was terrifying within the cramped confinements, The stink of powder, blood, splinters flying everywhere, or the ship trembling from recoil and hits sustained. Not to mention the noises. Powder booming, fizzling, men screaming, shouting orders. Your ears would have been ringing for days, weeks. Black powder produces a lot of smoke, and eventually sea and vessel both would be covered in it, making it more and more difficult to properly aim. Gunners had to be kept behind cover as much as possible, only opening the port when ready to fire. Otherwise, they might get pelted by muskets and enemy shot. On some vessels, the gun could only be loaded by having the gun port open, and sometimes loaders had to stand on platforms outside of the ship itself, rendering them entirely susceptible. That has to be the worst job on a pirate ship. If the ship lay low in the water, the gun deck might flood, rendering the guns unusable. Heavy rain could also ruin the powder of the upper guns. For a pirate, it might allow for an easy boarding. Stress-related accidents were very common in combat by sea. Usually it involved a source of fire getting into an ammunition setup. Spilled powder could create a trail, easily ignited by a dropped linstock. It might detonate a powder cartridge, or a gun could explode from overloading or overheating. Accidents opened a window of opportunity for the enemy. Especially underrated are the use of muskets in pirate and naval warfare. Muskets were less expensive than cannons in terms of material, powder and shot, while potentially able to do the same or even more damage, especially on the smaller cans of vessels used and targeted by pirates. We most often imagine them used by sharpshooters, the aforementioned topmen, targeting officers and the helm in order to cripple the steering and chain of command. However, they were as often used by regular shooters on the main deck. Pirate crews were often so large as to deploy entire batteries of musketmen, able to lay down serious volume. Volleys could destroy sails and rigging, or wipe the decks clean of hostiles. If each musketeer had several muskets designated to him, this could be done at a terrifying rate, and a favorite tactic of the French. The survivors were forced to run below deck, leaving the upper deck safe for boarding. Next, the guns had to be silenced. Musketeers targeted the gun ports, and by not firing all at once, they could keep up continuous fire on them, forcing the gun ports shut and unable to return fire. With the upper decks cleared and the gun ports suppressed, the enemy was ready to be boarded. Musket tactics at sea were different from the ones on land. On land, armies would usually stand in line and fire all at once. Even though pirates and mariners did fire volleys, these might be ragged and successive. Maritime musketry was more like urban combat. Individual shooters took cover below bulwarks or lay prone in the tops, aiming, firing, and loading at their own pace. Pairs of shooters could have a system in which one aimed and fired whilst the other loaded, allowing them to keep up a pretty constant rate of fire. Accuracy was favored above all, and the pirate's favorite weapon was a long flintlock musket called the fusil boucanier or buccaneer gun. The barrel was much longer than the average height of the period, and it was believed to make it more accurate. At very close ranges, the pirates were able to fling over hand grenades to scare, shock, and kill. These included iron grenados that fragmented on detonation, spreading a payload of scrap and nails. Fireballs were combustible grenades used for setting fire to enemy sails and ammo setups, causing confusion and destroying morale. Stink pots were a rudimentary form of tear gas, spreading a noxious stink that irritated eyes and lungs, forcing the enemy to seek cover or run from it. Swivel guns were another favorite weapon of pirates and merchants. These were small cannon, often breech-loaded, mounted on a swiveling fork on the ship's railing. Loaded with a single bullet or scattering junk, they could be used to destroy rigging or clear decks. They weren't good for penetration. Pirates often had a lot of swivels in relation to great guns, allowing them to load and fire in rapid succession. Gunpowder was as much a tool of terror as of destruction, and pirate tactics often just revolved around laying down enough fire as to awe the enemy into striking amain. In 1724, Richard Hawkins documented the assault made on a ship by Francis Spriggs. The again Descridos came up with me and discharged 2 broadsides, double, round, and partridge, with 2 full volleys of musketoons, blunderbusses, muskets, and pistols. And on hearing us make a lamentable cry for quarter, they ceased firing and ordered me on board. Duels at sea were a hot dance between the 2 opponents, constantly trying to outmaneuver the other and get into a superior position, the weather gauge or windward of the enemy. That is the direction from which the wind is blowing, and there were many advantages to it. For one, the gun smoke drifted down from them and into the enemy's eyes. It made him better protected from enemy fire, and their bullets would slow down or be disrupted from firing into the wind. Most importantly, since sail ships depended on the wind for movement, the windward vessel could basically maneuver how she pleased, thus dictating the terms of the engagement. It was very difficult, if not impossible, to board an enemy from leeward. However, the decks and rigging of the windward vessel were more exposed to enemy fire. So the vessel to windward had to fight to keep their position, and the one to leeward had to gain it, both maneuvering to fire effective broadsides while avoiding those of the enemy. The dance was utterly dependent on a good captain and helmsman, the former knowing what sails to use and when, what maneuvers to make, and how to con the helmsman. Conning means giving him orders on how to move, such as hard to starboard. The helmsman had to keep a cool head, keep the ship steady, especially making sure that the guns were aligned to give accurate fire, all the while avoiding the enemy's broadsides. Optimal was to rake the enemy's bow or stern, while avoiding the same. This could do as much as 10 times more damage. The ships were weaker at these sections, not so much at the bow. Its shape might also deflect shot, but the stern was flat, and by firing there, you might also destroy the rudder, preventing the enemy from maneuvering. It was a difficult position to reach. If you had a weather gauge, you could bear to and from the enemy, giving fire as you pleased, maneuvering to give one broadside, then turning into the wind, thus backing astern, bearing the other broadside and firing it, preferably into the enemy's stern, without letting the enemy get the gauge. If the pirates didn't have the gauge, they would target the exposed decks to disable enemy crew and rigging, either running the enemy below deck or giving the pirates the necessary momentum to get to windward. It was best to continuously keep to windward and stay out of musket range, which the pirates relied upon so heavily, plying them instead with artillery. In a calm or dead wind, oars could be pulled out and used to outmaneuver the enemy. Captain Kidd did so when fighting the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean. However, oars took up manpower needed on the guns and muskets. During Ned Lowe's fight with the HMS Greyhound, the combatants only used oars during chase, not the actual broadsides. Oars could also be targeted by great guns and destroyed. Another solution was to use canoes and rowboats. Whilst the flagships duked it out, the rowboat could get up on the enemy's flanks, sniping the officers and helmsmen, and sabotage the rudder. Such a disruption could allow the flagship to get the gauge, or even permit a full-on boarding. When fighting the East Indiaman Cassandra, Captain Richard Taylor decided to put his anchor in the rowboat, steered his boat astern of the Cassandra, where the anchor was dropped. Taylor's men then started working the capstan, slowly pulling their ship toward the anchor. This would have moved them astern of the Cassandra, where they could have raked her. Captain of the Cassandra, McRae, realized his futility and used the cover of smoke to escape in a longboat. Many a pirate enthusiast are undoubtedly familiar with the famous last battle in Pirates of the Caribbean 3, at world's end. An East India ship sails in between the Pink Pearl and the Flying Frenchman. Dutch people are basically swamp Frenchmen. I'm trying to piss off as many people as possible, and is blasted to shreds. In reality, this tactic was dangerous, since it allowed the quote-unquote trapped vessel to fire both broadsides at both enemies, while rendering the flankers susceptible to friendly fire. If two vessels fought in concert, it was better to form into a line and batter the enemy from one side. Fun fact, in the 17th century, frog was not used as a slur for Frenchmen, but Dutchmen, those beer-bellied, Hogan-Mogan butterboxes. One of them was a pirate named Lawrence de Graaf, and he did once sail between two Spanish vessels, both more heavily armed than his 48-gun frigate, Neptune. Lawrence fired first, starting with the guns, followed by musket volleys. The Spanish could barely respond, buying him valuable time. Although he never got the weather gauge, he constantly managed to outmaneuver the enemy, never allowing them to bring two full broadsides on him at once. Hot engagements could last for hours, even an entire day. When night broke, the crew might be permitted a chance of rest, only to resume their fight at first light. Others would gladly escape into the darkness, blaming perhaps a lack of ammunition. At this point, both vessels might be shot to pieces. Holes below the waterline, pumps working around the clock, holes in the masts, sails shredded, rigging mauled. That is besides the human cost. Sea battles could be absolutely brutal. Although you could take cover behind the bulwarks, penetration from muskets and great guns was inevitable. Great shot could pierce the wood and take away heads, limbs, or crush parts of the rig. Sailors might be crushed under falling masts, spars, and tackle. One of the biggest killers were the splinters produced when a cannonball pierced the hull. On the bigger vessels built from sturdy oak, the splinters were like daggers. If they didn't kill you instantly, it would be near impossible to get them all out, usually leading to death by infection. All of the sounds and gunfire would have your ears ringing for hours and days. That is besides the many accidents. Gun crews might not step away from the recoiling cannon, and it would hit like a truck, breaking bones, causing internal injuries, crushing toes, or even killing. If a flame got into a setup of powder, the men around it would be badly burned. Such an accident happened on a Spanish bark during the Battle of Perico, and Buccaneer Basil Ringrose documented the results. For not one man there was found, but was either killed, desperately wounded, or horribly burned with powder, insomuch that their black skins were turned white in several places, the powder having torn it from their flesh and bones. The wounded were sent, led, or carried below deck to the Lion's Den, where they would stand in line for the surgeon to tend them. I'm not entirely sure if the surgeons had a system for who they treated, if officers or more severe injuries were prioritized, but I can imagine so. It was far from an optimal operating environment. It was cramped, noisome, roiling with the motions of the sea, and dimly lit by a swaying lantern. In the tropics, it would have been terribly hot, and surgery after surgery would soak the deck with blood. Buckets of water were set out to wash it off. Light injuries were common. Men might get scratches, chafings, burns, bruises, and minor lacerations simply from partaking in stressful, violent action. These might not even need immediate treatment, and the minor ones might only need the removal of foreign objects, a tourniquet, or plaster. The mended might even be able to get up and return to combat. In the worst cases, an amputation might be undertaken. Any kind of surgery would have been excruciating in a day without proper anesthesia, excepting alcohol and the occasional dose of laudanum, a liquid opiate. Standards of hygiene were not the same as today, but it's not like the surgeons covered their tools in literal poo. The surgical tools were kept clean and preserved in oiled cloth, even though the risk of infection was higher than nowadays. Either way, pirate surgeons seem to have been very capable. After the Battle of Perico, only 2 of the 40 or so buccaneers wounded perished after treatment. The wounded were the lucky ones. In the battle between the Darrell and Mocha frigate, the captain documented the wounds and casualties sustained in gory detail. The chief mate was wounded above the knee with a piece of chain, fired from the pirates' cannons. The barber's mate had 2 fingers shot off when sponging a gun. The gunner's boy had his leg shot off, as had the quartermaster. Most brutal and graphic was the death of the captain's boy, his head shot off by a cannonball. If you ever thought pirate history to be silly, family-friendly fun, you can imagine that headless 10-year-old boy decapitated by a cannonball. The casualties on the Darrell were graphic but numerically mild. In the battle between the Cassandra and pirate ships Fancy and Victory, the pirates lost about 100 men, and 2/3 of those aboard the Victory. According to pirate Captain Taylor, blood had been running out of the scuppers, the vents used to clear rainwater from the main deck. Death could come to each and every man, and captains were not excluded from the Reaper's due. His death would have severe consequences on the handling and morale of the ship, especially if he had a grand standing among his men. However, if a captain was only wounded, he could turn it around and use it as a point to rally the company. Woodes Rogers was wounded in his battle with the Manila galleon. He was hit in the foot and face with muskets, leaving him fallen and crippled on the quarterdeck. Unable to speak, he had to relay orders by writing them on a piece of paper. It took 6 months until the musket ball was finally removed from the roof of his mouth, his foot mended. He'd go on to become governor of the Bahamas. Pirate captains were often less than lucky. Bartholomew Roberts was famously killed when trying to sail past and escape the Navy, shot in the throat by a piece of grape shot. He died instantly, his crew wrapping him up and throwing his body overboard. They continued fighting for a short spell before finally striking a main. A similar fate was due to the captain of a French privateer, defeated in 1698 by the Rhode Island sloop Loyal Steed. In the heat of battle, the Frenchman took a glass of wine and wished it might be his damnation if he did not board them immediately. But as he was drinking, a bullet struck him in his neck, at which he fell dead instantly. The French continued the fight until nightfall, when they decided to pull off. If a captain died, command was typically resumed by the quartermaster or some other leading officer. In other cases, casualties could be quite small. When Henry Every met 2 Danish merchants on the coast of Guinea, he fought them for about an hour until they surrendered. 1 pirate was killed and 5 Danes. In the battle between the Darrell and Mocha, wounds and casualties were brutal but numerically few. When Francis Spriggs captured Richard Hawkins, the pirates made their enemies surrender after a terrifying and overwhelming show of force, seemingly without taking many, if any, casualties. The longer a battle dragged out, the more likely it was that casualties would rise and rise. In spite of the horrendous costs, it might not be enough for an enemy to surrender. Should they flee to the safety below deck, or the pirates get in an advantageous position, they would close in and board their opponent. Thus began a new stage of unprecedented cruelty and brutality. If you would like to learn about boarding combat, please tell me in the comments and give this video a like. Subscribe and click the notification bell to get notified of when the video releases. Until it is released, I can recommend you to this video about the weaponry used in sea combat. This channel is always struggling against the stream of the algorithm and AI slop, And the best way to keep me afloat is by becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. This way you can also watch the videos without ads. Enjoy!